Hey adapters, welcome back. Today our guest is Clover Hogan. Clover is a 21-year-old climate activist and researcher on eco-anxiety. She has lent her expertise on sustainability to leading authorities, Fortune 500 companies, and classrooms across the United Kingdom. Clover serves as a trustee to Global Action Plan and is on the advisory boards of organizations such as the National Community Lotteries Climate Action Fund and many more. Clover will help us understand the relationship between mental health and existential threats like climate change. She explores the barriers that keep us from taking action on the issues we care about. She guides us in mapping our mental and emotional landscape so as to hone in on the problems we seek to solve. Hey, Clover, welcome to the show.
Hey, Doug, thank you so much for having me.
All right. Very excited to have you on. You are just doing some amazing work. And so I thought, how to kind of get started is first off, describe what is force of nature. Let's just start there.
Yeah, so Force of Nature is a launch pad to help young people step up rather than shut down in the face of the climate crisis. So we believe that the threat, even greater than climate change, is how powerless and small we can feel in the face of it. So we support young people from around the world with a student network in over 50 countries to really cultivate mindsets of agency and determination, resilience, upskill in the tools that they need to be effective agents of change. And we work with a whole ecosystem of enabling supporters, so business leaders, policymakers, who create forums for intergenerational exchange to really support young people as leaders and in turn learn what they can from the energy of youth.
Okay, so I do have to ask, you shared with us your bio, so we mentioned your age, 21, and it seems like you've done a lot. When did you actually get started on this, and, what inspired you, I guess, at the very beginning?
Yeah, so I grew up in Australia's tropical North Queensland, fishing frogs out of the toilet and dodging snakes that hung from the ceiling. So for me, nature was never an other. It was a really important part of my experience growing up. But I wasn't allowed to watch horror films as a kid, so I instead turned to documentaries. And at the age of 11, I was watching documentaries like The Cove, Food Inc., and Inconvenient Truth. And it was a rude awakening into the world of environmental exploitation, watching Al Gore point to graphs showing just how quickly we were devouring the world's resources and how good we were at pretending otherwise. So it was at a pretty early age that I came into awareness with the issues and specifically became really interested by our response to them. It shocked me that we weren't learning about climate change in school or that we weren't talking about it at the dinner table. We certainly weren't hearing about it from politicians. So I became really fascinated by our psychological response to climate change and why it is that we submerge some of the uncomfortable feelings that come up in the face of it. So that was when the curiosity started. And then I really started working on climate from about the time I was 13 and moved to Indonesia, where I went to a place called the Green School, which is unique not just because it's made out of bamboo, but because it really asks young people not to pursue careers that they have no love for, but which problems they really want to solve. So from an early age, I was asking those kind of questions and I was supported to find the answers. Started lobbying with the UN, started working with business leaders. So I've had a bit of a head start in solving these problems.
Okay, as a total aside, we've talked briefly a couple times before. I didn't quite get far north Queensland. Have you seen a cassowary in the wild?
Cassowary, yes, for sure.
Okay, you're so lucky. I'm just so jealous. I was there and I went up and never saw them in the wild. Not many of them left. And I guess I bring that up too is because I think our original conversation, you were in London. I think that's where you're based now, but you're currently in Greece. And so you're getting around a bit, right? You're international. And so I guess Indonesia, and I guess that's probably been helpful to you and I guess understanding this as a global issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the contrast of growing up in Australia, which at the time was relatively untouched, at least from my worldview, by climate change. That changed in November of 2019 when I watched from afar as my country was engulfed in flames. But I was relatively removed from impacts of climate change growing up. It was something that I read about, That wasn't the case in Indonesia, where problems like plastic pollution and social inequality were that much more visible, and of course where there was flooding every year that displaced hundreds of thousands of people. So moving to Indonesia gave me a much clearer view of just how immediate and just how pervasive the problem really was.
Okay, so let's dig into what you're doing. So, what is the relationship between mental health and climate change?
Yeah, awesome question. So I'm still really surprised by how this element is really left out of the conversation. We've had many of the solutions for climate change for a number of years. We've had many of the technologies. We've had the awareness of what needs to happen, and yet we really disregard the role of mindset, the role of our psychology. And so when I was 16 and researching the psychology of agency, I researched this thing called ecophobia, which was a term coined back in the 90s by a bunch of wacky psychologists. And it related specifically to the feeling of powerlessness in the face of environmental catastrophe. And that was something that I had experienced personally, but it wasn't something I realized was an actual phenomenon. And the deeper I dug, I realized just how pervasive this was. So as I worked with students, I realized how many young people felt too small to make a difference. And perhaps more surprisingly, when I started working with business leaders, I realized just how the very people in power felt so shackled to the system that they couldn't create change. And so I realized there was this kind of spectrum in response. We had young people who, in the face of climate change, were, falling into eco-anxiety, falling into fear and overwhelm and stress and really despair in the face of this crisis. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we had people in positions of power and much of the adult population falling into denial. So kind of pulling the rug over their eyes because it was a little too difficult to really look at and because they felt so small in the face of the issue. So everything that we do at Force of Nature is around this role of mindset, and much of the work that we do with young people specifically is around mental well-being and mental health. There's some awareness of there being this kind of silent epidemic of mental health problems in young people, and yet a lot of us don't realize just how much of that mental ill health comes from climate change. So if we look at research from 2019 from Friends of the Earth, it showed that over 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds were experiencing eco-anxiety. And in research that was published at the end of last year, in 2020, it showed that over half of child psychiatrists in England said that their patients were experiencing environmental anxiety, everything from panic through to insomnia and even guilt. So we're trying to understand at Force of Nature how we can actually harness these emotions. We would never want to pathologize eco-anxiety. Eco-anxiety is not a bad thing. It's a perfectly natural and human response to the climate crisis. It shows that you care. It shows that you're not numbing yourself to the issue. And yet, of course, if we don't have a clear sense of agency, a clear sense of what I can do as an individual to create change, that eco-anxiety can really tip into that ecophobia, the feeling of powerlessness. So we're trying to understand how to channel those feelings into action without disallowing them.
Okay, so this notion of eco-anxiety, I'm hearing a lot more of it associated mainly with climate change, and that's what you're in the thick of. But you're dealing with all sorts of folks. You're dealing probably with environmental activists who have been doing it for decades. And have you been exposed to people that kind of went through eco-anxiety? You go back in the 70s was a big time, especially in the United States, when there was a lot of pollution, a lot of legislation passed. Have you had conversations with people who kind of dealt with these things before, but they might not have called it eco-anxiety? And are any of those conversations sort of helpful to you? Had those come up?
Yeah, absolutely. And, eco-anxiety is a term that has more recently emerged into the wider lexicon. And there are lots of other terms that are kind of proliferating, whether that's solastalgia or climate grief, environmental grief. But of course, this is not a new phenomenon. What we're talking about is the response to being raised to love nature while also being complicit in its destruction. And we see how, eco-anxiety and eco-grief can be most prevalent in frontline communities, in Indigenous communities. There's a great piece that interviewed an Inuit elder who said, we are people of the sea ice, and what happens when there is no more sea ice. So there is a collective reckoning that is happening, and that has been happening for several decades. I suppose what's unique about eco-anxiety and the way that we talk about it within our organization is that for lots of young people today, it's in response to what is still a perceived threat rather than an immediate threat. So unlike, children in Jakarta or Bangladesh experiencing extreme flooding or extreme air pollution, lots of UK youth are still relatively in a bubble of climate privilege, and yet they too are experiencing insomnia and panic attacks and extreme anxiety as a result of the climate crisis.
Well, I guess I have to ask, which this is an area where you really do have to kind of be open if you're trying to relate to people. What's your eco anxiety? Is there something very specific? I mean, it might be a spectrum, but like, is it, well, sea level rise, that scares the heck out of me. I mean, how do you relate, I guess, your eco anxiety with other people?
Yeah, so I think I'm, as a person, someone who's experienced anxiety for a long time. And it was often something that I thought I had to kind of beat into submission. I thought that it was a weakness. And especially when it came to working on climate and working on climate change from such an early age, it's become a key part of my kind of identity. And so I thought that I had to wrestle those feelings into submission and that I had to kind of conquer them. And I think that's a pretty dominant narrative in society. We have a perception of positive emotions versus negative emotions. And we're not very good at creating space for the ones that we deem negative. But I was forced to confront that story that I was telling myself in November of 2019, when for the first time climate change became very real for me, through loss, through watching from afar as Australia was engulfed in flames and as 1 billion animals were incinerated in the inferno. And as I called friends who were, poised on tin roofs, armed with hoses, trying to keep back the blaze. It was the first time that climate change was very real and that I had to reconcile the loss of my own culture and my own home. And so that was when eco-anxiety became real for me. And that was when I appreciated that there was this kind of huge mental health crisis being created by climate change, both as perceived and a real threat. So I think I'm better now at creating space for my eco-anxiety, but at the same time, I've also learned where to channel it and the role of those emotions in really waking us up to the issues.
Okay, so let's talk about the process. It sounds like you work with all sorts of people, you work with companies and such, but you do focus on young people. I mean, what are the ages? And so is it working with schools, or is there what kind of platform are you actually engaging them with? And I guess sort of briefly, what does it mean to work with them and help them?
Yeah, so pre-pandemic, we were working in schools across the UK, and then COVID-19 posed a really important innovation challenge, which is how do we continue to reach young people through a digital format? And so we launched online classrooms, and so now all of our programs are online. Every week we run anxiety to agency classrooms where we really support young people really to create space for these feelings. We've been referred to as AA for the eco-anxious. So we try to create community where we normalize those feelings, but we learn how to actually channel them into something tangible. So in that, typical classroom, we're supporting young people to map their mental and emotional landscapes, get clear on which feelings really serve them and which feelings they want to leave behind, and begin to get the focus of a problem as well. We are very focused on tangible change and supporting young people to be agents of change, driving forward solutions in their own communities. And we also appreciate that without that inner work, it's very difficult to do the outer work. So we try to keep both hands clapping at all times. once students have gone through the anxiety to agency classroom, that's when we take them through a series of programs where they have the opportunity to actually focus in on a single problem, get clear on the skills and talents and passions that they can show up to solve that problem with, and then connect them to forums for intergenerational exchange. So it's very much a holistic system, because all of the work that we're doing with business leaders is about bringing together the energy of youth with the knowledge of experience. So how can we create opportunities for young people to have a seat at the decision-making table, share their ideas and their energy and passion, and how can people in existing positions of power really benefit from that? At the start of the episode, I talked about this kind of divide in despair versus denial, and generally the despair of young people versus the denial of older generations. And yet, while we feel in the face of these issues. So there is incredible power in actually connecting those two groups together. For young people, learning from that knowledge of experience and learning how to create change, whether it's in policy making or it's in business. And for business leaders, creating the space to really connect to their feelings and connect to the energy and velocity of the youth movement. So that's kind of the process that we take young people through, and very much 2021 is about how to create better forums for intergenerational exchange so that we can kind of get outside of this polarization of conversation that has happened.
Well, you're still a relatively new organization, so you probably haven't had too many opportunities to do this, but I imagine 2, 3, 5 years out, a chance to kind of reconnect with the people that you've worked with and, ask them, are you still eco-anxious? And I mean, people are always going to have some level, but I think that would be sort of an interesting, and have you had any early sort of feedback in that respect that some people are saying, I'm feeling much more grounded and what I'm doing here helps me deal with it?
Yeah, so everything that we do is driven by research and data, whether that is the latest research on psychology and climate, or it is internal research that we're conducting, surveys that we're sharing with young people. So last year we took 500 young people through our programs, and we were able to see through very extensive surveying immediately after programs and then further out as well, the young people felt much more hopeful, much more empowered, much more clear on how they could actually create change in the world. So we have that feedback coming in, which is super exciting, and we're expanding out those impact metrics now so that we can really think from a data-driven perspective how to create that shift in mindset and what it looks like on paper.
Okay, so in the community room, I got a question here from Mike is, can you share an example of someone channeling their anxiety and affecting real world change beside yourself, which is obvious, or a case that was particularly inspiring?
Ooh, that's a brilliant question. So I'd say the first person who comes to mind is an incredible eco-psychotherapist whose name is Caroline Hickman. And she was one of the first people to really bring eco-anxiety as a theme into the mainstream. She, 20 years ago, wrote her thesis on the relationship between the harm that we inflict upon ourselves and the harm that we inflict on the planet. And she drew the relationship between self-harming and shark finning. And back then, it was seen as completely woo-woo and kooky, and yet now there's growing research as a result of all of the incredible work that she's done interviewing young people and frontline communities around the world that shows the importance of that relationship and just how much we have divorced ourselves from the natural world. Caroline is someone who has walked head straight into her anxiety and her grief and fear rather than disallowing it. And I think her background in Jungian psychotherapy is really what's allowed her to do that. But I suppose to answer that question more broadly, I think every change maker in history has learned how to channel their agitation or a sense of injustice or anger into, taking personal responsibility for a problem and solving it. We disallow some of those emotions because we don't have a clear sense of agency, a clear sense of what we can do. And that's why so many people are kind of sleepwalking toward the edge of the cliff, which is has kind of happened on a societal level when it comes to the climate crisis. if we were to allow it to take up every waking moment, we'd probably drive ourselves crazy. So it's really critical that we realize that the injustice that we experience personally on behalf of someone else is in fact our superpower, and any one of us can go on to change the world, drive solutions, if only we create space for those feelings.
Okay, so we're getting toward the end of our interview here, but I guess I have to ask too: is do you feel connected with, there's this big youth climate movement, and it's not some all one big organization or something. We hear about Greta Thunberg; she just turned 18, but do you feel connected with that group? Do you feel part of that, or is it just what you're doing kind of on your own? And you're just working with younger people?
Yeah, I mean, we're absolutely dialed into the Youth Strikes for Climate, and very lucky to be part of that network of young climate activists from across the movement who are driving incredible change, and testament to them for bringing this huge threat front and center stage when it had remained on the periphery of our collective consciousness. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has taken much of that airtime up, but it is huge testament to the determination and resilience of young people focusing on this issue. And really, I've seen that impact working in boardrooms. We work with companies like PepsiCo and Unilever and Procter and Gamble. And consistently, when I ask business leaders why they're in the room, why they care about climate change, it's because one of their kids came home at the end of the day and asked, "Mom, Dad, what are you doing about climate change?" So this role of intergenerational exchange is critical. And I suppose what we have to be cautious of is not allowing intergenerational breakdown to happen where, young people are kind of pointing the finger at older generations, and older generations are pointing the finger back and just writing young people off as hysterical, which is something that I've heard quite often in closed door rooms. So we need to create much more space to really be compassionate toward one another and understand one another, and realize what each generation truly brings to the table.
Okay, so final question: what's next for you? I know we're dealing with COVID, and you sort of alluded to some of the things that you're doing, but next 3 months, next 6 months, what do you hope to accomplish?
Yeah, so Force of Nature is now a team of 7 people,
Wow.
which is just incredible. So we have lots of really big things in the pipeline. This year, we really, really want to serve as a forum for intergenerational exchange. We want to institutionalize youth engagement, whether that's in policy making in the lead up to COP26, or that's in businesses across the world, establishing youth advisory boards, supporting young professionals within Fortune 500 companies to feel like empowered agents of change and constructive disruptors. And of course, we're currently producing the next season of the Force of Nature podcast, which is going to be the deepest dive yet into eco-anxiety as a rising phenomenon, how young people are metabolizing the climate crisis, and how we feel and think and act in the face of it. So lots of exciting things in the pipeline.
Oh yeah, I forgot to ask about the podcast. And so it's a typical podcast. You can find it anywhere you find any traditional podcast, right? And how long have you been doing it?
Yeah, so we started in June of last year. So we did a great first season interviewing 9 ordinary people doing extraordinary things for the planet, who you should definitely check out. From one of the world's first climate lawyers to a woman who started a grassroots movement out of her backyard, and we're currently working on the second season to have out by late March of this year.
Well, we'll definitely put just a link or whatever. We have a page within Simpatico for this episode, so we'll include all sorts of things that you do there. So that'll be great. Yeah, podcasting, and I, as a podcaster myself, it's people kind of come out of the woodwork, and it's always interesting to see how people respond to what you're doing there. So that's great.
Yes. Amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, Clover, it's been a pleasure. I'm always just dazzled thinking about when young people doing certain things, and you are just well ahead. I mean, it's just amazing what you've accomplished in such little time. And 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you're going to be a legend, if not already. So I appreciate you stepping it up. I want to bring you to Just Chatting as we close this out. But again, thanks for coming on Simpatico.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Doug.
Okay, just one sec.